Stephen, thank you for starting off our panel today. We are now live and you are free to go.
Great, thank you very much. Hi, my name is Stephen Doig. I'm the Director of Research at the Arthur L. Irving Institute for Energy and Society at Dartmouth. And today's panel is Sustainable Energy for All. Welcome and thank you all for attending. Today we have a number of distinguished guests on this panel, whom I'll start with introductions and we'll take it from there. First, Richard Florizone, President and CEO of International Institute for Sustainable Development, I believe hailing out of Ottawa, Canada. Rose Mutiso, also co-founder and CEO of Mawazo Institute. Nicole Poindexter, co-founder and CEO of Energicity. And finally, Narasimha Rao, Associate Professor at the Yale School of Environment. Today's panel is really to talk about what are the greatest challenges to increasing access to quality energy services across the world while also ensuring a sustainable climate. During this conference already, we've heard about the billion people who don't have energy at all and the billions more that have very scanty or scattered or unsustainable energy systems. Today, we're going to focus on explore how societies can address issues of unmet energy and services quality and globally throughout the lens of culture, demographics, technology, economics, policy, investment, and equity. With that, the way I'd like to start today's panel is have each of the panelists provide their own view of what sustainable energy for all really means, how we should think about it, and what are some of the key messages that we should all recall and remember. And then from there, we'll jump into a series of questions and ultimately take questions from the audience. Thanks very much. What I'd like to do is perhaps start with you, Nicole, if that's okay, and just give us your views on what do we really mean by this topic, sustainable energy for all?
Sure, thank you, Stephen. Just a quick word of introduction. My company, EnergicityNicole, we're a mini grid utility, and it's probably helpful to define what that means. What it means is we're a utility, just like your utility in, Dartmouth or in New York, just, like Con Edison, we sell electricity to customers. What makes us different are a few things. The first is we serve small villages and towns that are disconnected from the main grid. So there could be a large grid somewhere else, but we're serving a small locality, and that small locality has poles and wires that we've built, but it also has generation. The generation that we use, the second thing that's different, is solar. It's predominantly solar and battery, so we're providing 24-hour power to people in these villages. And then the third thing is that we work in rural Africa. So our customers are smallholder farmers and typically some of the world's poorest people, making on average around $5 a day. So what we mean by sustainable energy for all is actually providing power to these people who live in these circumstances that are without electricity. We do it through mini grids, and what we think is really important is that we're not just providing electricity, but we're providing electricity as a means for economic development, that the one leads to the other. And so, yes, for these rural customers, we're providing light, but also we're providing their healthcare centers with ultrasounds and vaccine fridges. We are providing cell towers with power. We're providing electric vehicles with power. So we're powering this future economy, but then we're also powering the economy that is really today. And that's really a focus on agricultural processing and helping farmers add value to their crops through electrification. I think the last thing that I'll say that's helpful is to just give a picture of what people's lives are like and talk about one of our customers. Her name is Abena, and she, before we came to her village to provide this mini grid, she was a trader, and she would travel 10 miles each day on the back of a motorbike to buy ice and fish. Then she'd bring it back to her community and she'd sell the ice and fish in her community. But because the ice is melting and the fish is spoiling, she didn't make very much money. She reported that she made about $1 a day. And then our mini grid came, and she saw that the mini grid had power that was reliable enough, that was affordable for her, and that was scalable. So she thought she could buy a freezer, which had always been her dream. So she bought a freezer, and she was able to grow her business, providing actual ice made in the community by freezing fish so that people could actually buy the fish that they wanted. And her income increased by 10 times, from $1 a day to $10 a day. And that's really what's available by powering these communities that are currently off grid with sustainable solar-based power to really transform economies and enable people to thrive.
Great, thanks, Nicole. Richard, maybe we can turn to you next and you can provide your perspectives.
Well, thanks, Stephen, and thanks to the Irving family for the vision behind the Institute and for this event today. What great stories, Nicole. Let me build on them, and I'll take up Stephen's charge. I'll try to be brief and just take up Stephen's charge to share 3 points that I think are takeaways on this topic about sustainable energy for all. The first, and it really builds on Nicole's point, is that electrification is one of the key pathways to net zero. We know that in developed countries, that's why there's the hype about electric vehicles, but it's an incredibly powerful pathway in developing countries. You know, if you don't believe me, go watch Rose's TED Talk, and I'm sure we can provide the link on this. Rose really makes clear the point that Nicole just made, which is energy and economic development are inextricably linked, right? They're just the same topic. It's energy that fuels economic development, and so you need it. But within that, electrification is very powerful because we know, even in the developed countries, because of its efficiency benefits, because of its potential emissions benefits. But in developing countries, what we see from our work is, of course, it has tremendous health benefits. So the work we've done with displacing kerosene, for example, for cooking, that has a lot of negative health benefits, respiratory, even correlation with things like cancer. You get health benefits. You also have benefits for women, right, who are disproportionately involved in food and preparation, other things. So electrification, I think that would be one of my key points. Electrification is one of the key pathways to net zero. It's got really strong benefits in developing countries. The second point I'd kind of make is that, and I maybe with an asterisk, is I'd just say that smart policy doesn't always have to require major investment. Now, sometimes it does. And again, Rose, you'll see what a fan I am of your TED Talk, because Rose makes the point that, you know, when we talk about electrification, it's about the small scale solar panels, but it's also about the larger sources of clean, reliable electricity that will fuel economic development. But my point, so sometimes investment is needed, and I'll come to that, but it isn't always, sometimes smart policy can be done with smart investment. So an example for us, back to the kerosene example, we've done a lot of work in India. India historically had invested heavily in kerosene, fossil fuel subsidies. So back in 2014, the government of India invested about $8 billion US a year subsidizing kerosene purchase to make it more affordable for people. Now, of course, a lot of Indians wanted to have solar and wanted electrical sources of cooking. And so a lot of those subsidies have kind of been redirected. So in other words, by taking those public funds and redirecting them in new ways, you're able to achieve the environmental and economic outcomes that you want. Now, of course, that's only possible because costs have also come down, right? Technology has been really important. Solar and batteries have been revolutionary. They used to have such a significant premium. But there are ways, and we have to push ourselves to look for smart policy that's paired with smart investment. It doesn't always have to be a giant amount of money. But the third point, maybe, and maybe it contradicts my second one, is that you know, I really want to emphasize that as developed countries, we have an opportunity and a responsibility to help developing countries respond and adapt to climate change. So you saw, I was just celebrating, we were talking about it on the panel before we went live at the Leaders Summit earlier this month, where President Biden committed to a doubling in adaptation finance, or a doubling in international climate finance, a tripling in support for adaptation. You know, these are really important. There's the public sector is absolutely needed. There's room for the public and private sector, but there's room for public sector capital to de-risk. And much of that was actually spoken about on the previous panel as well. So with that, thank you, colleagues. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you. Rose, I should naturally turn to you now, but you can't, of course, talk about your TED Talk because Richard's already talked about it. So give us your perspectives, though. You've been on the ground a lot.
Richard, you're too kind. Thanks so much. I'll see you after the panel to discuss your the quid pro quo for all the. No, I'm just kidding. Thank you so much. Yeah, so I'm obviously a massive fan of you know, the work that has been described beforehand. Nicole, you know, it's just amazing. her mini grid company. I remember several years ago when you packed up from DC and and you're in DC and moved to Ghana, and now you're in like multiple countries. I mean, that's really like inspiring and important stuff. And my work, the research director at the Energy for Growth Hub, and we are, we think about the large infrastructure part of energy poverty. But first, I just want to take a moment to say that the stuff at the residential level, at the village level, at the household level is really critical. And it's one of those things that sometimes I feel it's an obligation. Like there's a kind of brilliant political scientist that I know from my childhood, is a professor at Georgetown, Ken Opalo, look him up on Twitter. And, the other day he tweeted that, we don't need a study that tells us deworming children improves their test scores to deworm them. Just deworm the children, just do it. And I think some, people needing lights in their homes, having that basic access, not having their livelihoods disrupted by the few fish or producer, the small amount of producer producing on their farms go to waste. Those are no-brainer interventions that I just think that we should get behind without having to really stretch the metaphor of these are the this is the CO2 that's avoided, or you know what I mean. I just think that sometimes that can be a trap, that this is important work on its own merit. Putting that to one side, so the work, the part of the energy poverty challenge that I focus on, which is consumption outside of the home. So in kind of mature economies, it's about, and I'm talking about electricity. I know Narasimha and other people might talk about, and Richard did, about other fuels and stuff. So I'm talking about the power sector. So in the power sector, consumption in mature economies, consumption outside of the home is about a quarter. It's about 3/4 of electricity. And so, electrifying homes, very small businesses, that's just a small piece of the pie. Most of the consumption is in the productive centers. In countries, in poor countries like in Kenya, our utility, 3,000 customers are responsible for like over 60% of the utilities revenues, 3,000 out of millions, out of several million. So, and those 3,000 customers are like large and industrial customers. And so a lot of the missing energy in poor countries is the energy that's not being used in factories, in industry, in commercial sectors. And those are the ones that drive employment at scale and that kind of thing. And so a lot of our work at the Energy for Growth Hub is to really draw attention to that there's the really critical consumption at residential level, at the village level. Let's do that. I just think that we should just do it. It's important. It's part of our social contract. But then at the same time, the real meat of the problem in terms of scale numbers happens at this hidden productive center world. The second piece of the sustainable energy for all story that I like to focus on is the climate piece, because that's something else that people think about. So people are thinking about economic growth. So how does electricity drive economic growth? And we're saying really it's at this level of like productive center electrification. B, how does electricity and energy tie into climate change? And I think this is where, in rich countries, we know the formula. It's energy, cut energy use, so energy austerity of some kind, so let's use less, and then decarbonize. In sub-Saharan Africa, and like kind of really poor, low emitting countries, this is completely backwards. So there's no power sector to decarbonize. There's very negligible emissions to begin with. So sub-Saharan Africa is responsible for a fraction of cumulative emissions, and so one, there's nothing to decarbonize, and two, to adapt to climate change, to be resilient, we need massive energy consumption growth. So we need to irrigate in the villages and in the farms. We need to cool because of extreme temperatures. We need to have infrastructure that can deal with the disasters and the changing climate. And so all of these are energy intensive. And so, I mean, these are just kind of a couple of pieces. I know that I can see some of my co-panelists kind of giving me looks, and I would love to hear thoughts on this. But I mean, so I think that's my piece, is like, where does the energy, or electricity in this case, come to drive economic growth at scale? And how do we think about the strategy for climate in poor countries differently?
Thanks, Rose, really appreciate it. And Narasimha, let's hear from you too, and then we'll jump into a mixed up conversation here.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to have such experienced panelists. I'm going to sit comfortably here in my ivory tower and make comments about energy access around the world. I have had a decade of experience in energy and development, including working on the ground, doing field work across South Asia, all the way up to now at the global scale, doing modeling to understand energy needs for eradicating poverty globally. So I hope I have a bit of a perspective on the ground as well. Actually, my panelists have made one of the key points I wanted to make about the fact that we need to see energy as an enabler of development. But still, let's think about some of the actual facts on the ground. So the Sustainable Development Goal 7, SDG 7, is still a binary indicator. It's an indicator of do you have a connection or not? And it is still being tracked. Progress is still being tracked that way. And we've done some research in 10 African countries based on surveys of the World Bank and found a large percentage of households who are declared as served, they have serious affordability issues with energy access, and they don't enjoy the services that we've been talking about. So, this is the broad global picture, as we're still thinking of energy access as do you have wires or not? Okay, in thinking about it as an enabler of development, what does that imply? Well, first of all, in the home, it implies that in addition to energy access itself being affordable, the appliances that you need for the services need to be affordable. And in order for that, very often you need credit to be able to qualify for financing to invest in a new product, right? And in order to be able to do that, you need sources of livelihood. So when we think broadly about the needs, they start to go beyond just the immediate solution at the household. There's a chicken and egg problem now because we're thinking about energy access as generating livelihood opportunities, income growth, but that takes place over a long period of time. I know Nicole has given an example, and there will probably be many examples of sort of this quick income earners, but by and large, the literature shows it takes many, many years. And it takes for other services for government to provide. People need access to roads so they can get their products to the market. They need access to finance, as I mentioned, and the government has to be responsible for all of these different services, not just electricity access. So it's really a difficult problem. I do think that the disruptive capability of solar and battery has really changed things, which is wonderful. I mean, the example of Nicole's is really encouraging. But we need to find out how much we can scale this across, say, 800 million people. Okay, we cannot forget cooking. Clean cooking is a second pillar of SDG 7. We have 3 billion people relying on solid fuels. This is a persistent number for decades, despite incredible efforts by governments, international efforts. Why are we not able to move past that? We need to answer that question. And we can talk about that in the discussion. I agree electricity is the final solution, but we think about the number of kilowatts, the number of watts we're talking about to enable that. It's an order of magnitude at least above what we generally provide with energy access. So, and the governance of electricity sectors in the countries we're talking about needs serious reform. If you're really going to provide electricity reliably to cook food, you can't afford power cuts if you need to rely on food for it, rely on it for food. Okay, I think I should stop there. The last thing about the climate point, I just want to make a provocative statement. My research has shown that if you look at the energy needs, including in the home and outside the home, to provide people with a basic standard of living in modern society, this is not just a light bulb and a phone charger. This is a refrigerator, access to water and sanitation, access to mobility. All of that actually comprises a fraction of the energy use in the world. A tenth, for example, of what the US consumes today, which is to say that affluence primarily is driving energy demand and climate emissions in the future. This doesn't mean we're not concerned about locking in fossil technologies to provide energy access. We are concerned about that, but let's be clear, in all countries in the world, including in developing countries, it's affluence that's driving energy demand growth and needs to be addressed, not the basic energy access. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. That's great. And we got exactly what I was hoping for, which is a diversity of views. And I think also a painting of the picture of the complexity of the challenge. It's a system solution that we need. There's no sort of silver bullet here. There might be some silver buckshot, but it's probably more like a web of solutions. And with that, I want to sort of start at a very large level then, and then we'll drill down into certain areas. There has been talk over the last 5, 7, 8 years about how the developing world can leapfrog the developed world in energy systems, much like mobile telephony worked in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. And I'm just wondering, that sounds like an alluring idea, but given what we've just heard, what would it really take? And is it possible for places like countries in sub-Saharan Africa, countries in Southeast Asia, to actually build out electrical systems such as Nicole's mini grid system, which are already on a relatively sustainable footing, using distributed energy and battery storage and perhaps some amount of diesel genset, to get to an answer which is actually already more sustainable? Or do we need to go through the large scale power distribution systems that have been built up in developed nations and which are now being deconstructed in order to address both climate change, but also resiliency and energy security? And so I guess I'm really just wondering what people's picture of, if we leap to the future of what things should look like in developing nations, is there a way that we can get to an answer where the developing world is chasing that rather than the stepwise fashion of development that's happened over the last 120 years? Perhaps, Nicole, you want to start?
Sure. I will go out there and say, absolutely, yes, we can leapfrog. And my real answer is a bit more nuanced, but you know, the reason I got into this business actually didn't start out being a passion for electrification or a passion for working in Africa, though I had done it before. It was that I wanted to solve the question of what does it take to have 100% renewables on the grid, because I think that's an important question for the US and for the developed world of how we solve our affluence generating climate emissions problem. And I also believe that I actually had some interesting insights from working at a prior company around how people use electricity and how do you match consumption with generation in a way that you really need to do that for renewables to work. And you can't test those ideas. You can't look at or think about those ideas in the US. At the time when I started our business, we had 1% solar on the US grid. Hopefully it's higher now. I haven't looked at the statistic, but with that as a foundation, you can't ask this question, but you can ask that question and you can work to solve that question in rural communities that are so far from the grid. The cost to string a wire from the main grid to this community is cost prohibitive. It just will never actually make economic sense versus a mini grid. And so we actually, by virtue of the constraints, we have to be creative about the solutions and drive to a set of solutions. But I do think, having been at this for 6 years now, I don't think that mini grids are going to be the core solution for the United States. But I do actually think that there are learnings that we're learning in deploying energy systems in Africa that are critically important for thinking about how we work in a quote unquote developed world or an affluent world with more renewables on the grid, with better matching of supply and demand, with more focus on efficiency. I think that we're learning critical things that actually are applicable to the rest of the world.
That's great. And Rose, I'd like to build on that for a moment, because you've made the point that in real economic development that really improves people's lives and their economic wherewithal, you need to think about the energy that's consumed outside the home. Do you see that possible to really build up, real economic activity outside of sort of small scale enterprise using distributed generation, or do we need to complement that with large scale generation?
Yeah, I think to answer, I think the short answer is both. The long answer is, maybe before I even get into it, it's important to, for the benefit of the listeners, especially who I think many are based probably in the US or in the West, to really kind of get behind this question of scale. So I think, Stephen, you were building like a net zero, like off the grid house at some point. I don't know if this project is still ongoing, really, really cool project. But, if you think about just rooftop solar on a home, what is residential consumption in the US? So rooftop solar on a home is maybe what, 3,000 kilowatts is an average size or something like that. This is just to power a typical American home. The kind of small solar home systems or distributed systems in places like Africa, this is what, like 100 Narasimha, I don't know, 100 watts, 200 watts, and that will give you like really good basic power, So this is, I know, orders of magnitude different in terms of what distributed energy looks like in scale in rich countries versus poor countries. And so, for example, mini-grid as a technology, I mean, lots of people in the US have been deploying this, universities, the military, and they have massive scale, kind of really kind of swanky, powerful systems that can deliver, you know, that can kind of power a lot of end users. And so I think it's important to compare like for like. So we're not saying it's not possible to reimagine a new system in which like you have smart distributed energy generation and interconnections between different endpoints and whatnot. But I think that the distributed energy reality in Africa, the scale is so small, the consumption is so small. This is not a model that as is being deployed right now is going to really feed into the growth of the industries that are needed. So I think that's just one point, is it's helpful for people who I think really kind of experience distributed energy quite differently in rich countries to really understand what we're talking about in poor countries. The scale is very small, and it's a starting point. The second thing about leapfrogging is, I think leapfrogging is happening in many ways. And I think a classic example is the mobile phones, right? So everyone is like, you know, Africa has leapfrogged, and this is the kind of demonstration of what's possible. But so at the kind of consumer level, having the phones has changed lives, including, you know, lives of my family and many people I know. The other day, though, I did a piece in Scientific American with my colleague from the Energy for Growth Hub about the infrastructure that underpins this digital revolution, right? So you do have the cell towers, there's been a step change in infrastructure. So we're not doing like the old telephone lines and whatnot. So there's been a leapfrogging of a kind, but we still need substantive infrastructural investments to make the digital revolution possible. So the undersea cables, the data centers that are power hungry. This is what takes that everyone has a cell phone to. Entrepreneurs in Nairobi are creating apps, you know, that we are producing content that's being housed locally in data centers, you know, with very high speeds on the continent. Like, again, this is the step change that's needed even in the digital leapfrogging story is still very infrastructure driven, still requires massive investment in physical stuff. And so the same applies to energy, that to really get the scale, and to really deploy renewable power and renewable sources at scale, that really transforms how energy is consumed and used, that we can get away from the infrastructural investments. We can't just have like power on an app or whatever.
Great. And Narasimha and Richard, before we hear from you, this strikes another point in my mind, which is, as we're thinking about the energy systems of the future and the potential to leapfrog, maybe we should also be thinking about the businesses of the future. Do we really need to build smokestack industries and heavy duty smelters, or do we start using accretive manufacturing, which sips energy used to compared to an electric arc furnace? And I wonder, as we're thinking about the role, for example, Richard, of the developed world in helping make this energy transition happen, that we should also be thinking hard about which economic opportunities could be stimulated or supported, what infrastructure needs to be put in place, to Rose's point, that doesn't simply repeat what happened in the 19th and 20th centuries in the world, but actually helps us leapfrog to where real business is going to be in the future. And Rose finally just made a very interesting point. My off-grid home is a 6 kilowatt system. It has a wood shop in it that would be considered a small scale factory in sub-Saharan Africa. And many products and economic activity could happen with this small system, which I think, to your point, Narasimha, might mean that we don't need to build a gigawatt dam, that in fact, we could put these in, and we could even try the fail fast approach that says, well, that one didn't work, let's get on to the next thing. So with that added context, maybe Narasimha, you would like to just respond with your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. Those are all great comments. I do think we need to think about what problem we're trying to solve in the first place. I think we think about leapfrogging because in some sense, there's a bit of a clean slate in developing countries as opposed to dealing with the stranded asset problem. But a lot of the concerns about new technologies still apply, and you'd be hard pressed to argue that poor countries should be the leaders of the technology leaders in some of these new technologies to be trying to develop. but they can be a place where we try to pilot them with support from other countries. So I do think, the kinds of mini grid solutions are scalable today with batteries and with solar, and that's great. And we should, in certain parts of the world where it makes sense. I think in a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, I think that is a viable model, and we can scale that out with a smart grid and with consumer participation. But that involves, again, leapfrogging in terms of handling and managing technologies that are completely nothing like people have ever seen. I mean, we just talked in the US about whether we can get poor low-income communities to use, to get involved in demand-side response, because there's a digital divide. And so we're expecting that in villages in Africa. It's a tall order, but it's possible. And the second thing is, we need to break down and see the different aspects of the economy. So there's industry, how are we going to leapfrog with cement and steel? Certainly, electric arc furnaces are in South Asia, in fact, already producing 30% of steel. But it's much more difficult with other basic infrastructure and with cement and fertilizer and food production. But then transport, if we want transport to be ultimately electrified, then we're talking about massive expansion of the electricity grid. And I'm not sure if small scale, village mini grids are going to serve that need. Again, it depends upon context. We expect that 75% of people in the world will live in cities by 2050. So, if you want to tackle really broad scale energy solutions and leapfrogging, we have to leapfrog in cities. And I do think there's scope for that. I actually do think that the number of cities that we expect to exist in 2050 that don't exist today are many. And we need to invest in things like public transit, electric public transit. It's one of the most important insights from my research, is how we can make a difference in the future. Now, where's the potential for leapfrogging there? I think there's significant potential in thinking about how do we introduce shared mobility, electric shared mobility. I think people already do use shared mobility in developing countries by virtue of necessity. So we can take advantage of that and use new technologies to ride on that cultural, trend. And I think those are opportunities. I think the hard part is, the industry, food production, fertilizer, and some of the other basic infrastructure.
Thanks a lot. Richard, do you have any comments you want to add to this? I'm cognizant of the time. I want to get on to a couple other questions, but please feel free to add your thoughts.
Well, I'll just be very brief. Look, there's a lot to unpack here in terms of where to invest in the future. I won't hazard predicting and placing bets, but I will say that I think we all have a responsibility, and I think there's a lot of investors on the even at the session at the conference today. We all have a responsibility to make sure that we choose pathways that don't lock us into a high carbon future, right? That we look for those sectors and the infrastructure of tomorrow, that we consider workers, we consider the impact on environment. And that's not just out of social responsibility, it's also good business, right? In Canada, we're big ice hockey fans, and we always quote Wayne Gretzky about you got to skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it is. And so, what's the future economy, and where will those jobs and economic opportunity be? And that's where we need to go. And that's why, Larry Fink and BlackRock have said, climate needs to be front and center. The only other thing I'll offer is that, and this may sound like I'm turning the argument in and of itself, is that when you think about the investments that are good for the environment and good for the economy, that hit both of those globally, and you look at what global economists are saying, there was actually a study out of Oxford with Joe Stiglitz and other world leading economists that basically identified of their top 5 of the best investments to make. It's investments in businesses like Nicole, and she didn't pay me to say that, but basically investments in clean energy infrastructure have some of the best stimulus and some of the best environmental impacts. And so these are not just good for the planet, right? These have good economic multipliers, and they're good economic investments.
That's great, thanks. I want to ask another broad question, which may well take us through our time here because of its complexity, but there has been, in my experience in working in sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world, there's been a sort of a back and forth about the role of the private sector and the role of the public sector. And it sort of, that pendulum swings back and forth sometimes. Well, it really is all private sector. We need to make it happen that way. And it's the public sector. And so at the broadest level, the question really is, well, what are your views on what are those roles, and where is the public sector best placed to make a difference, and where is the private sector best placed to make a difference? but I'm going to frame it around this question, which has bugged me for a while, which is, why haven't member-owned rural electric co-ops taken off in rural Southeast Asia and rural Sub-Saharan Africa when they were so successful in rural North America, in Australia, and other places? And I can't decide if that's a structural thing or it's a political thing or social thing. And it strikes me with the advent of distributed technologies that are relatively small scale, relatively low capital investments, you don't have to go to the public markets in order to stand up a mini grid, for example, Nicole. And so why aren't there member-owned electric co-ops all over the world that are looking out for the best interest of their customers? Anybody want to feel that one?
I'm happy to jump in. Part of why is, and so I don't know the full history, for instance, of rural electrification in the US. I know about the Tennessee Valley Authority and a lot of the co-ops that sprung up around that, but there are co-ops that are beyond the Tennessee Valley. But what I can say about the Tennessee Valley Authority is, the rural co-ops that grew up around that were really, the generation was the dam. And the rural co-ops that grew up around that were really retailers of electricity to these rural communities. And while they were probably maintaining some poles and wires, it was really just a sale of electricity. Our business is actually, I won't say that the business itself is really complicated, but the care and feeding of a mini grid system is a very complicated day in and day out activity that requires trained people to do it. Not to mention a software backbone that's leveraging IoT technology that, by the way, we make in Sierra Leone. But it's actually a high-tech venture sitting on top of solar assets, which both are low maintenance, but also do require trained technicians. And it's hard work. It is not something that someone whose day job is a rural farmer is really going to be able to be successful at. And what you see with a lot of different installations that were designed for that is what happens is that someone will install the system and expect and hope that the community will take it over, and they're just not able to continue to maintain it. And I think part of it is in the US, before I started running a utility, I would have not been able to do it. I think it's not a function of their capacities. It's, I think, really a function of it. This is a specialized field that requires a lot of expertise.
So does anybody else have a differing point of view? Because I don't want to go down that rabbit hole of rural electric costs, but I'm wondering if there's
a little bit. So I would say, I think there's a question of I agree entirely with everything Nicole said, but another thing I'd say is we do have some examples. So for example, in Kenya, tea cooperatives have pooled resources, and they have like run-of-river mini grids and some solar and stuff like that. And I think so there are some examples of that. And I think maybe what is the commonality there, maybe going back to the rural cooperatives in the US, is just pulling demand, pulling purchasing power. And so I think at the time of the USDA rural electrification plan, the per capita incomes of even rural US farmers and education levels and purchasing power and whatnot was kind of much higher than like the really survival levels that people are living in. And so such undertakings require a lot of capital, and you need to pull demand, you need expertise, and that's just not there. And that's why, and also these are small countries and small communities. And so the US is just on a different scale in terms of people. And so sometimes having a regional utilities that cover a lot of people also makes sense.
Great. Well, Richard or Narasimha, maybe you have some additional thoughts, especially on the sort of roles of private and public capitals and investments.
I was going to say, Narasimha, can I leave you the wise last word? But go ahead. I was going to let you go last.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
You'll have something more wise. All I'll say is that, since we're talking about an economic transformation, by definition, we need private sector capital. right? But I think there is a broader discussion going on, the arc of kind of macroeconomic kind of theory and discussion over the last 30, 40 years. There's definitely in policy circles kind of a rethinking of this role of the state, right? And I think it's definitely tending towards looking back at history and saying, hey, maybe active industrial policy, really does have a role. And Nicole's example again is a powerful example, right? Because when you have gaps in knowledge, that's a market failure. Like the market can't solve that necessarily alone, right? So you have to find creative ways. Again, smart policy, smart investments, ways to tackle public and private. And there's lots. The good news is there's lots of great ideas and lots of great discussion. And I think a revisiting of that balance between the state and private sector. But now Narasimha will have a much better summary and wrap up. So I'm proud to let him go last.
Oh, that's too much pressure. No, I think I see two different points in your question, Stephen. One of them is centralized versus decentralized. And I do think in places where you have a bit of a clean slate, the days of centralized grids are over, except you have that already existing. And so I do think there's a lot of scope for decentralized systems. However, the question of private versus public, I think, is a bit of a false dichotomy. We're talking about the poorest people in the world here. Whether it's going to be private owned or public, it has to be a strongly regulated environment or utility so that you have standards of service, you have a universal service obligation, and you have really affordable rates. So I almost think, I don't care public or private, we need a strongly regulated sector to make sure people get the benefits that we're all trying to achieve.
I told you he should go last. See?
No, that's interesting and provocative in and of itself, Narasimha, because there's been this whole trend in the developed world, the US, to deregulate our monopolies, to deregulate the industry. And yet, I tend to agree, because I think about, Nicole, a mini grid is a de facto monopoly. You plop down in the middle of nowhere, you provide power. And there may be examples of monopolists not acting like monopolists in the world ultimately, but there's not very many of them. And so this is a really interesting point that maybe we should end on, is how do we bring in the right amount of regulation and control and incentive to ensure that high quality power systems that will last over time, that will be economically viable, are possible, and yet not fetter it so much that you don't get the kind of entrepreneurial efforts that are required to really get things going. And so with that very broad thing, let's hear 30 seconds from each person to say, well, what about that one? And then we'll call it a wrap. Anybody want to start?
Well,
go ahead, please.
Well, I'll be quick. I just think this does point to the fact that ultimately the onus is on local government. I do think it plays a really strong role, needs to play a really strong role. And that's the most important thing, to make sure that we usher in solutions that benefit the people and that they can be democratically determined as well.
Fantastic. Nicole?
We love our regulator partners. I strongly believe in our industry being regulated to deliver on the values that both you and Narasimha have discussed. And our regulator partners, I think, I might be the only person who argues our regulator partners should be paid more, but I think that they are critical to this whole system working. So we're excited about them, and we support them whenever we can.
Fantastic. Richard, final thoughts?
We know we need clean, affordable, reliable power, generally electricity. To get there, it's going to need private sector, but as we've just heard, we clearly need the dynamism of the private sector, but we need regulation, right? We've heard particularly on price and reliability on those kinds of things. You need a strong framework. So, we've got to take advantage of this moment in history to try to unleash all those forces and make some great progress.
Fantastic. Rose, any last thoughts?
This has been a great discussion. Thank you. I think I wish we had more time to delve into each of this, but yeah, so I think for poor people, we need government support and some kind of form of smart subsidy. And I know subsidy is a tough word, but I think that there has to be support for people living on survival levels, and we can get around that. Like poor people are poor, and we need to face that fact. And the government should be a partner there. And then obviously the private sector comes into play in other parts of the value chain. And I'm not denying that either. And we need a referee to kind of watch the space.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much. I mean, clearly we could have kept this conversation going for another half an hour or more. There are so many more topics to talk about, but I wanted to thank all of you for your perspectives. I hope the audience itself now has a much broader view of this opportunity of sustainable energy for all, and take away the message that it's really energy for economic development done in a thoughtful way. There seems to be a way to thread the needle to make it sustainable and at least climate neutral, and that we need to do so in a way that's a balance of public and private interests that actually allow this to really unlock itself and to overcome this really serious challenge of many billions of people either having inadequate amounts of power or none at all. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you to the audience.
Thank you.